You think ancient Greece was just philosophy and democracy, marble statues and Olympic games. But behind the gleaming facades of Athens and Sparta lay sexual practices so disturbing they would shock even modern audiences accustomed to every form of human depravity. But before we continue, if you like dark, forgotten history, consider subscribing and comment where you're watching from. It helps us a lot to make more videos like these. Now back to the video. The ancient Greeks didn't view sexuality the way we do today. There was no concept of sexual orientation as we understand it. Instead, Greek society operated on a rigid hierarchy based entirely on sexual dominance. Your role during intimate acts determined your social standing, legal rights, and political power. Being the penetrating partner meant masculinity, authority, and citizenship. Being penetrated meant femininity, submission, and social death for adult men. This wasn't some abstract philosophical concept. This hierarchy shaped laws, determined careers, and literally decided who lived as a respected citizen versus who died as a social outcast. The sexual politics of ancient Greece created a system where power and pleasure became inseparably linked, leading to practices that would horrify any modern civilization. Let's start with the most normalized horror of Greek society. Pederasty wasn't some underground perversion. It was the cornerstone of elite education, celebrated in art, praised in literature, and protected by law. Adult men in their 30s systematically pursued sexual relationships with boys as young as 12, calling it mentorship and education. The practice followed specific social rules that make it even more disturbing. The older man, called the Erastes, would court a boy called the Eromenos through elaborate gift-giving and public displays. These weren't secret relationships. Families often encouraged these arrangements, viewing them as pathways to social advancement for their sons. The boy's beauty and the man's status created a marketplace of child exploitation disguised as cultural tradition. Archaeological evidence shows pederastic scenes painted on pottery, carved into monuments, and celebrated in public spaces. These weren't hidden decorations. They were mainstream artistic themes displayed in homes, temples, and government buildings. The normalization was so complete that refusing these relationships could damage a boy's social prospects, more than accepting them. The age parameters reveal the calculated nature of this system. Boys became available for these relationships at the onset of puberty, around 12 to 14 years old. The relationships were expected to end when facial hair appeared, typically around 18 to 20. But here's the truly disturbing part. The timing wasn't about protecting children. It was about maintaining the power dynamic. Once a boy developed masculine features, continuing the relationship would threaten the older man's dominant status. The educational justification adds another layer of horror. These relationships were presented as mentorship programs, where older men taught younger boys about politics, philosophy, and social graces. But the sexual component wasn't incidental. It was considered essential to the educational process. The Greeks believed that physical intimacy created emotional bonds that enhanced learning and character development. Modern scholars debate the exact nature of these relationships, with some arguing they were primarily emotional rather than sexual. But contemporary Greek sources leave little doubt about their physical reality. Legal documents discuss regulations for these relationships. Medical texts describe physical practices, literary works celebrate the sexual aspects openly. The evidence is overwhelming and disturbing. Spartan military culture took these practices to even more extreme levels. The Agoge, Sparta's legendary military training program, began when boys were 7 years old. Removed from their families, these children entered a system where older warriors became their mentors, trainers, and sexual partners. The practice was so institutionalized that refusing participation could end a boy's military career before it began. Spartan warriors were expected to form intense emotional and physical bonds with their trainees. These relationships were considered crucial for developing the fierce loyalty and courage that made Spartan armies legendary. But the psychological impact on children forced into sexual relationships with adult authority figures was never considered. The system prioritized military effectiveness over human dignity. The selection process was methodical and cruel. Older warriors chose their favorites based on physical beauty, athletic potential, and family connections. Boys who weren't selected faced social ostracism and limited career prospects. Those who were chosen entered relationships they had no power to refuse, with men who controlled every aspect of their lives. The training itself combined physical brutality with sexual exploitation. Boys were deliberately underfed, inadequately clothed, and subjected to harsh discipline. In this vulnerable state, they depended entirely on their older partners for protection, food, and emotional support. The system created perfect conditions for psychological manipulation and abuse. But pederasty was just one aspect of Greece's disturbing sexual hierarchy. Women faced their own systematic degradation through practices that reduced them to property and breeding stock. Marriage in ancient Greece had nothing to do with love or mutual consent. It was a business transaction where fathers sold daughters to husbands who could afford them. The age gap in marriages was staggering. Men typically married in their 30s, while girls were given away as early as 12 or 13. These weren't partnerships between equals. They were arrangements where adult men gained legal ownership of children. The wedding night often involved what we would today recognize as statutory rape, celebrated as the consummation of a legitimate marriage. Greek law codified women's inferior status with brutal precision. A wife couldn't own property, conduct business, or make legal decisions. She existed entirely under her husband's authority, with no recourse if he chose to abuse that power. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated, it was considered a husband's right and responsibility for maintaining household order. The isolation of women reached extreme levels in many Greek cities. Respectable women were confined to their homes, forbidden from participating in public life or social gatherings. They couldn't attend theatre performances, political assemblies, or religious festivals that included men. Their world shrank to the domestic sphere, where they existed solely to produce legitimate heirs and manage household affairs. But even within marriage, women faced additional humiliations that reveal the depth of Greek misogyny. Husbands routinely maintained relationships with male lovers, female slaves, and prostitutes. These affairs weren't hidden or shameful. They were expected aspects of masculine behavior that wives were required to accept without complaint. The sexual double standard was absolute and merciless. A wife's adultery was punishable by death or permanent exile. A husband's infidelity was considered normal male behavior. Women who showed jealousy or resentment were viewed as unreasonable and potentially dangerous to social stability. The system trapped them in marriages where they had no rights, no voice, and no escape. Religious prostitution added another dimension of horror to women's experiences in ancient Greece. The Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth maintained over 1,000 sacred prostitutes, donated by families as religious offerings. These women weren't volunteers serving a divine calling, they were human sacrifices to economic and religious systems that commodified their bodies. The practice operated under religious sanction, making resistance not just difficult, but blasphemous. Families dedicated daughters to temple service, knowing they would spend their lives providing sexual services to male worshippers. The religious framework provided moral justification for what amounted to organized sexual slavery. The economics of sacred prostitution reveal its true nature. Temples generated enormous revenue from these services, funding construction projects and supporting priestly hierarchies. The women themselves saw none of this profit. They were valuable property generating income for institutions that owned them completely. Their bodies became religious commodities in a system that sanctified sexual exploitation. Archaeological evidence from temple sites shows the industrial scale of these operations. Living quarters for hundreds of women, elaborate bathing facilities, and administrative buildings for managing the business. These weren't small religious practices. They were major economic enterprises built on systematic sexual abuse disguised as divine service. The selection process for temple prostitutes followed familiar patterns of exploitation. Young girls were chosen for physical beauty and family desperation. Poor families saw temple service as their daughter's only option for survival, while wealthy families used it to discharge religious obligations without sacrificing their own comfort. The psychological manipulation extended beyond individual relationships into systematic cultural programming. These girls entered temple service believing they were chosen by the gods, blessed with divine purpose. The religious indoctrination was so thorough that many came to view their exploitation as sacred duty, unable to recognize their victimization even as it destroyed their lives. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Greek sexuality was the normalization of erotic magic designed to control and manipulate unwilling partners. Ancient Greeks practiced love spells with the same casual acceptance they showed for any other form of commerce. These weren't harmless romantic gestures. They were calculated attempts to override consent through supernatural coercion. The magical practices revealed the depths of Greek attitudes towards sexual autonomy. Men regularly employed spells to compel specific women to desire them, viewing magical coercion as perfectly acceptable when physical force might be inconvenient. The spells themselves involved elaborate rituals including burning effigies, reciting incantations, and burying cursed objects near the intended victim's home. Archaeological discoveries have uncovered thousands of curse tablets containing explicit sexual demands. These weren't abstract wishes for love or affection. They were detailed instructions to supernatural forces, commanding specific sexual acts from named individuals. The tablets describe binding spells designed to drive women mad with desire, forcing them to abandon their families and seek out the spellcaster. The language used in these magical texts reveals the predatory mindset behind them. Women weren't viewed as autonomous beings capable of choice. They were targets to be conquered through whatever means proved effective. The spells treat female sexuality as territory to be claimed rather than intimacy to be shared between consenting partners. Professional practitioners offered specialized services for different types of sexual coercion. Some focused on seducing unwilling partners. Others specialized in breaking up existing relationships to create romantic opportunities. The most disturbing category involved spells designed to make women sexually insatiable, transforming them into objects of pure lust incapable of rational thought. The effectiveness of these practices mattered less than their widespread acceptance. Greek society tolerated magical sexual coercion because it reflected broader attitudes about male entitlement and female autonomy. If a woman could be compelled through physical force, economic pressure, or social manipulation, magical coercion seemed equally legitimate. Even more horrifying were the documented practices of zoophilia that appeared throughout Greek literature and historical accounts. While often attributed to other cultures, the frequency of references and mythological themes suggests these practices were familiar concepts in Greek society. Their literature doesn't condemn such acts as perverse, treating them instead as exotic curiosities or divine mysteries. The mythological framework provided justification for behaviors that violated every natural boundary. Stories of gods transforming into animals to seduce mortals weren't just entertainment. They were cultural templates that normalized bestial practices by giving them divine precedent. Zeus becoming a bull to rape Europa wasn't a cautionary tale. It was a celebrated myth, performed in theatres and depicted in art. The medical and philosophical writings of the period discuss these practices with clinical detachment that's more disturbing than outright condemnation. Greek physicians wrote about treating injuries resulting from animal contact. Philosophers debated whether such acts violated natural law or represented alternative expressions of human desire. The casual academic approach reveals a society where nothing was considered too extreme to discuss or practice. Even the concept of consent, limited as it was in Greek society, completely disappeared when it came to slaves and foreigners. These populations existed entirely outside legal protection, available for any form of sexual exploitation their owners desired. The systematic abuse of enslaved people reached levels that make plantation slavery look restrained by comparison. Greek households routinely maintained slaves specifically for sexual purposes. These weren't individuals who happened to be attractive. They were human beings purchased and bred for their sexual utility. Children born from these arrangements became property of the household, continuing the cycle of exploitation into the next generation. The legal framework supporting this system was comprehensive and ruthless. Slaves had no right to refuse sexual demands from their owners or anyone their owners designated. Resistance was punished with torture or death. Even testimony about sexual abuse was inadmissible in court because slaves couldn't legally accuse citizens of wrongdoing. The scale of this exploitation becomes clear when examining household inventories from wealthy Greek families. Hundreds of slaves, categorized by their intended use, including explicit sexual purposes. These weren't hidden records. They were official documents filed with local authorities for tax and insurance purposes. The system operated openly because it was perfectly legal and socially acceptable. As we reach the end of this journey, through ancient Greece's sexual horrors, the pattern becomes unmistakably clear. Every practice we've examined operated through the same fundamental principle that might makes right. Whether targeting children, women, slaves, or even animals, Greek sexual culture was built on the systematic exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. The philosophical justifications they created for these practices reveal the true genius of systematic oppression. By calling child abuse education, sexual slavery religion, and magical coercion romance, they transformed horrific crimes into cultural virtues. The victims couldn't resist what society celebrated as beneficial to them. This wasn't a civilization struggling with moral questions about sexuality. This was a society that had answered those questions by deciding that the strong had unlimited rights over the weak. The democracy that gave political voice to male citizens operated alongside systems that silenced everyone else through sexual subjugation. The legacy of these practices echoes through history in ways most people never recognize. The philosophical frameworks that justified Greek sexual exploitation influenced Roman law, Christian theology, and Western legal traditions. The same arguments used to defend pederasty and sexual slavery appear in modified forms throughout subsequent civilizations. Understanding this history matters because it reveals how easily sophisticated societies can normalize horrific practices through cultural conditioning and institutional support. The ancient Greeks weren't primitive barbarians acting on savage impulses. They were educated, philosophical people who created systematic justifications for behaviors they knew caused suffering. Perhaps most disturbing of all, they succeeded in presenting their civilization as the birthplace of reason, democracy, and human dignity. For thousands of years, scholars have studied Greek philosophy while ignoring Greek sexual practices, preserving the myths while burying the reality. The marble statues and democratic ideals survived. The voices of the victims were silenced. The next time you see ancient Greece portrayed as a golden age of human achievement, remember the children forced into sexual relationships with their teachers, the women treated as breeding stock, the slaves who existed solely for their owners' pleasure, and the magical practices designed to override human consent. Behind every marble column stood a system built on sexual exploitation, so comprehensive it makes modern atrocities look limited by comparison. That's the real legacy of ancient Greece that history classes conveniently forget to mention.